All right, so a bit about Michelangelo's Deposition, which is the sculpture you can see in four pieces up top here in this title slide. This will put into some sharp material relief the work we've gone through with John that will make John happy, since he is so interested in the dichotomy between the flesh and the spirit, between matter and pneuma. Or the animus, the spirit, or the soul, whatever you want to call it. This piece is an incredible piece. I'll start there. Do note the date there at the bottom. I guess we can start from the beginning in that regard. So 1555. Now, if you recall, the last piece of Michelangelo that we looked at was completed in 1504. Is David. So this is 51 years later. And this is one of the last pieces that Michelangelo ever works on. In fact, it may be his last. I have to look that up. But he begins work on it when he's 72 and works on it for 8 years. We should probably start with the title and discuss who's even being depicted in the first place in this piece. So you can see the top left corner, that's the star of the show in many ways. In terms of the alternate titles of this piece. That's Nicodemus, although some interpreters take him as Joseph of Arimathea, who is the man who's responsible for taking Jesus off the cross and also likely gave his own tomb to Jesus. And deposition, in fact, is the word that's used to describe that act. That is to say, of taking Jesus off the cross. So you can see, if we go over to the second piece here, you can see Jesus very prominently depicted in the very center. On our left, that is to say, on Jesus's right, that's Mary Magdalene. We'll go into some of these characters in a moment. And then to Jesus's left, our right, is his mother, Mary. If you go to this third picture here, you can see that this sculpture is unfinished. It's one of several works of Michelangelo's that was never finished, and there's quite a few interesting stories about that I'll get into in a second. All right, so if we start with composition first, I've just put a sculpture that's familiar to you on the right-hand side of this slide, and if you recall, that is Bernini's snatching of Persephone, right? So there's Pluto, the god of the underworld, snatching Persephone away. If you remember, you can see his fingers sink into the flesh, the stone flesh, right, of Persephone. And I only do that to show you the development here of high Renaissance sculpture. So you can see Michelangelo influenced by a lot of new ideas in sculpture and art in general. We'll talk a little bit about that in painting. So you can see, first of all, the multiple figures here, some suggestion of movement, but most certainly the outright explicit portrayal of intense emotion. In this case, it's suffering, of course, whereas in Bernini, he tends to focus on arguably more frivolous things, and even more disturbing things in some ways, perhaps. So a close-up here of some faces. I did want to show you Nicodemus's face up close, if only because it's generally interpreted to be modeled after Michelangelo himself, which is fascinating, and is one of the faces that is one of the faces in the sculpture that is most finished. Right, you can see a lot of the chisel marks in the stone still left there. And then we can see Jesus's face in the right-hand side here, and then Mary, the mother of Jesus, here on the lower panel there. And our final face to take a look at, we've got Mary Magdalene here on the left-hand side. Now recall, that's Mary Magdalene has a very complicated relationship to Jesus. She is typically depicted in the biblical tradition as a prostitute and friend of Jesus. but in less mainstream sources, their claim is also made that she is the wife of Jesus. Okay, and finally, some final commentary here. I wanted to show you Michelangelo's Pieta. All right, that is on the right-hand side. That's in the Vatican today. One of his greatest masterpieces for sure. In some ways, I want to show you this by way of composition, and also talk then about the more complicated composition here in many ways of the Deposition. So what you see depicted on the right-hand side here, of course, is the Pieta. So that is Mary. This is a classic theme here in medieval and Renaissance art, and even beyond that. And that is Mary expressing her grief over the death of her child. It's one of the most difficult things to depict in terms of composition, because you have a full-grown adult man whom you have to somehow fit on the lap of his mother, and the intensity of the emotions of such a scene speak for themselves quite clearly. In many ways, you could argue this is something like the female version of the crucifix. So this is the suffering that is engendered when you allow a child to act freely in the world without the protection of a mother. And this is the price that's paid, and it's a personal sacrifice, but it's one that's for the greater good of all of humanity. So it's a really deep piece here, and we could actually give probably a 20-minute talk on this. Now, the reasons I showed you this, however, is that there are some art historians who take the Deposition as a composite piece of sorts. There was a fashion in this period of the High Renaissance in painting to attempt to depict multiple scenes from a narrative in one panel. And we talked a little bit about that when we initially studied sculpture. That is the fact that sculptors have a difficult choice to make when they're trying to tell a story, because they can only focus on one little bit of it. So some art historians have taken this as something of a composite scene. So that is to say, on the one hand, you have the Deposition, so taking Jesus off the cross, but then you can see Nicodemus laying Christ into the arms of his mother. So there's the suggestion that there's a continuity here in the narrative, and we're moving into the Pieta, and you can certainly focus on different pieces of the sculpture in that regard. And then finally, with the presence of Mary Magdalene as well, and the uncertain identity of Nicodemus as perhaps Joseph of Arimathea, this could also be a scene that is transitioning to taking Jesus to his tomb. So it's a 3-in-1 in many ways. Now, just one last little story here to bring everything fully to bear on this sculpture. So we talked about, of course, the fact that it's unfinished. Michelangelo was designing this for his very own tomb, which is fascinating. After years of working on it and becoming frustrated with it, now there's all kinds of ways we can interpret this frustration. One very practical one is there was apparently some sort of flaw in the marble that made certain parts of the sculpture inoperable for Michelangelo. And as we know, he was a perfectionist and quite obsessed with creating work that was timeless in its beauty and perfection. On the other hand, however, there are also other interesting, maybe apocryphal stories that surround this. So Michelangelo, in fact, destroyed a great deal of the sculpture. So he knocked off, for example, the left nipple of Christ, his arm. He completely removed his left leg and damaged the sculpture in innumerable other ways. It was eventually restored, of course. But this could be both the result of frustration, but it could also be the result of a fear on the part of Michelangelo of the piece being misinterpreted. There was a movement at this point called the Spirituali, and they were Nicodemists. That is to say, they were Protestants without advocating a movement fully away from Catholicism. And when you're in a Catholic society and you're doing work commissioned by the Pope, that's quite a dangerous piece to be in. And then making a sculpture about Nicodemus, you can imagine how that sort of thing would be misinterpreted by certain authorities. And this left leg, at the time of the sculpting of this, did not have rich symbolic significance, but then as Michelangelo was sculpting this, the left leg became a common sort of hidden symbol in high Renaissance painting as an intimacy that may be even suggested as sexual if it was laying over the leg of another person. It's apparent, if any of this is true, maybe none of it is, that Michelangelo wished to eliminate the possibility of a misinterpretation, because really he was just trying to depict the body of Christ in the most natural way. It is extraordinary, of course, the shape, and this is the last little bit I'll say, the shape of Christ's body. You can see it winding down in this serpentine way, and you can see the arm bent on this unusual angle. And this is one piece that if you do see this in person, you can see a beautiful patina on it, and you get a sense of what this piece may have looked like if it were fully finished.